Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. I'm here with Rich Vince, who has his own YouTube channel and shall be debating veganism with me. He will be debating, I think, that veganism is a matter of perspective. Is that right, Rich?
Yeah, that's about right. We started off with the question of, is veganism a moral obligation? But after a very brief discussion, we kind of narrowed it and down to this more specific question.
Yeah, I think that pretty much sums up like why we've chose this question, and it's because Rich's position is, which we'll let obviously Rich explain because I don't want to straw man him, but that morality in general comes down to the perspective in which we can justify something as being good or bad. Is that right?
Yeah, so I would say that I'm a subjectivist, and I think that we can all construct our morality. It's not something objective, but it is subjective, and it may differ from person to person. And thus there exists different moral frameworks. There exists different perspectives.
Yeah. Now, do you want to give yourself a quick introduction so that obviously people now know the topic area? Do you want to know who Rich is? I think you all know who I am. If you don't, I'll just give you a quick lowdown. I run this channel called Perspective Philosophy. I have a master's in philosophy from one institution in Durham University in England, and I think veganism is a moral obligation, and I try to actively debate this with other individuals as well as other topics of interest. And now, Rich, would you like to?
Not much of an introduction. I'm philosophically illiterate, if anything, especially when compared to Lewis, I would say. So I guess that's a little bit of a disclaimer that Lewis may have to define some of the terms that are brought up in this discussion. But I think that's beneficial for not only for this discussion, because then it makes it easier for us to establish a common language in the sense that we explicitly define the terms that we're using, which is good. And it's also good for the audience who may not.
Yeah, exactly. We'll be talking in more like the common tongue.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's true. And I think as well, it's important to recognize that philosophy is not just for philosophers, but for everyone. There is no reason why a philosopher can't talk to someone who has not studied, 7 years in philosophy, because a lot of the time, people have good ideas and will have justified ideas many of the time they've thought about these things. And Rich seems to have given a great deal of thought to this. So regardless of him being academically qualified, I still think he is qualified to speak on the area on this topic area. And remember, Socrates was walking the streets of Athens. He wasn't sat in the academy just chatting to his mates. So anyway, without further ado, let's begin. So Rich, would you like to explain as to why you would say that you would reject veganism as a moral obligation?
Yeah, so I already touched on this in my very brief introduction. I'm a subjectivist. And with that, I mean that I don't think that morality is, that there is such a thing as an objective morality. I think morality is a concept that we construct ourselves, and it could theoretically essentially be defined arbitrarily. But the point is that we define it, and different people may define it in different ways, because different people construct different perspectives. And so to say that everyone is bound by the same moral framework, to say that veganism or anything else for that matter is a moral obligation just doesn't seem right to me. So that's a high level introduction of my perspective.
Yeah, you see, I would deny that, and I would deny that for a few reasons. The first reason I would say that morality is objective. I would say that to argue that morality wasn't objective would remove us from what we are. So morality, meaning decisions on good or bad behavior, like what is good or bad, comes from the Greek ethikos, and this relates to behavior itself, how we choose to act within the world. And that as beings who are subjective, who can feel good or bad, it is necessitated that we feel these things. It's how we achieve these things that is in question. We don't say that it wouldn't make any sense to say that morality doesn't exist if we mean ethikos, because we would say Okay, well, good and bad 100% exist. These are the positive and negative phenomenological experiences of the day-to-day person. So I go through life and I can feel joy, I can feel sadness, and to dismiss these things seems nonsensical because I would be rejecting the most basic stimuli of my own experience. It's the understanding of these things and how we come to conclusions about how we achieve them and how we reach happiness that we are really coming into a lockerheads with, and how we achieve that. Now, what I would say in that regard, that not only is morality objective there, but that conceptually we will come to the same conclusions based upon reason and like logic itself. That logic facilitates the necessity of acting one way or another, and that's because um, of what language, of how language works. Language works by taking these phenomenological experiences and we express them to the other, and then the other then sees these as utterances of an experience that goes beyond their experience. It's a totality, okay? But this totality, the totality of their experience, sorry, of our experience, is an infinity to the other. It expresses itself as something foreign, like exterior, and that is an object. We are an object to the other individual, at least linguistically. We are presenting an object which did not originate purely from themselves and their own perception, and instead originates from both of our perceptions. Language itself then is used to justify whether a behavior is good or bad. We would say that we would use words in order to give justifications as to why we act one way or the other. And through this use of words, we can then say that one is good or bad epistemically. This is epistemic moral realism. Now, I don't think, Rich, I don't know if you actually deny epistemic moral realism. So this would be saying that this would be like Ayn Rand would probably go down this route. And then like, well, it would be before Ayn Rand even, it would be like saying that good or bad exists. And then based on the fact that good or bad exists, and that you want to achieve innately, good or bad, that you will use the greatest means to achieve it. So this would be saying like, I ought not to set myself on fire, right? Because you could say that because by setting myself on fire, I am denying what is necessitated in what I am being a human, something that wants to not feel pain and achieve happiness. Setting myself on fire would be counterintuitive. It would actually be a contradiction to what I am. And so this is how you escape the Isolde gap, because you're not actually instancing something that doesn't originate in the individual. However, to gain that point, you have to actually accept language itself. And once you accept language itself, I would say that you are placed into a position where you can accept an evaluation which does not come to you subjectively. Now, I think this is probably where you're going to not like, you're going to say that actually it's a matter of my perception alone. Is that right?
Probably, yeah. I mean, you talked a lot, so there are a lot of terms that we have to sort out here. First of all,
Yeah, and I obviously there's a lot like to cover. I was just trying to give like a brief overview of like why I would reject it.
Right. No, it's a good introduction. It's a good overview. But yes, I would say that fundamentally we are limited by our subjective, well, perception of the world. We cannot access, even if there is such a thing as an objective reality out there, we as subjective beings do not have access to that. So that is one of the fundamental assumptions that I make. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. 100% agree that you cannot breach the totality of your own experience, at least by yourself.
Right. So when we're talking about objective, well, we would have to define this word, first of all. What is objectivity?
Yeah, I agree. I think because if we were to say that subjectivity was everything, then objectivity can be nothing.
Yeah. So we would not even be able to talk about objectivity.
Yeah, but most of the time we would speak of objectivity as being that which goes beyond our understanding. So, for example, it's the idea of a tree falls in the woods and no one was there to hear it. Does it make a sound? Now, if I was to ask you that, would you say it made a sound or not?
This is it. This is my perspective is that it depends on how we define these terms. It depends on how we define sound. Is it the physical vibrations that are generated in air, or is it the perception itself? Because if it is the perception of sound that defines the term sound, then if the perception, if no one is there to perceive it, then there is no sound, obviously.
Yeah, yeah, I would.
Yeah, so then the question is, okay, these vibrations, do they occur? We can only talk about that conceptually. I mean, we can only imagine that such, if we do not observe them or perceive them, then we can only imagine that such vibrations actually do occur. So we cannot verify that.
Yeah, I would say that it would be, it remains in a state of lacking verification. But is it rational to assume that it does? I would say it is. I would say that it is rational because it's based upon all of the evidence that we have so far. It's like what Hume says, where he says, okay, we can't assume actually that the laws of physics apply everywhere, but we wouldn't be wrong in assuming that they did.
Right. And here's where you talk a lot about justified belief, right?
Yeah, yeah. Justified.
Could you elaborate on what you?
So justified belief, epistemic justification is something that can be either so like if you look at what justified means, it's not something that is infallible, but rather something that can be pointed towards as being rationally provable. And so we can verify it without a given amount of falsehood existing. Obviously, if it's fallible, some falsehood will remain, and this will be a problem of language more than anything else, because it would be improper conceptualization of the experience. Now, what the point of what I'm trying to say is that in language allows us to conceptualize the world in a very particular way. But language allows us to conceptualize the world, but the conceptions themselves are not constructed by a single individual, because they would cease to be language. Would you agree with that?
I would say that everything that we justify is justified and verified through our own experience. I mean, we as subjective beings verify it for ourselves using our own sense-making mechanisms. So it is not objective. We are still constrained by our subjective nature, I would argue.
Yeah, but I mean, in this regard, though, that this is the thing where you would say, like, well, nothing is objective,
right?
But then, so I mean, that's like saying, like, for example, if we're looking at it like that, we would say that science doesn't speak of objectivity; it speaks of subjectivity.
Yeah, I would probably say that too.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. But then, I would say that this could lead to a place of epistemic anti-realism. There's two ways it could go. You could either doubt reality, in which case you can only know that you yourself exist. And then even then, I would say that that is a breach of something that you can possibly know, because you've now rejected epistemic justification. You can no longer rely upon another to verify what you're actually experiencing. And instead, now you know that all you can know is that there is something thinking. This is the end of Cartesian doubt. So, like, if you know of Descartes went into this process, where he sat down in his dressing gown next to the fire, and he said, well, what can I doubt? And he comes to this conclusion that he can doubt pretty much everything. In fact, he can doubt everything, including logic, because he says, if an evil demon was placing every idea into my head, how would I know that that these ideas are not inherently wrong? Right, so that a triangle doesn't in fact have three sides. Now, there's no way to get around that, because if it was an evil demon making sure that, like, scrambling or some sort of computer that scrambled every single thought in your head, well, there's no way you could actually know it. And so you just have to accept logic. Logic is necessitated, right? And that's something that we just all have to agree with, because if we don't agree with it, then you're ending up in fatalism, where you can if you don't, and I would even go so far as to say you couldn't even utter a word, because by uttering a word, you've conceptualized. You've said that meaning has occurred and experienced in a single event, in which case the laws of logic have been applied.
Right. Yeah, what I would say, I would probably agree with you to a great extent that we need some framework to talk and communicate and to understand the world to begin with. But what I'm arguing is that when we do that, fundamentally we make a lot of assumptions. we assume this logical framework that we use to make sense of the world. It is assumed. We
Well,
cannot.
yeah, but there's a difference between tautological arguments. Sorry to interrupt. So I would say that there is an assumption, which means like it's circular reasoning, where it would be tautological. So it would be logic is logical, for example. You can't prove that logic is logical, but it is necessary. Now, there's a difference between a necessary assumption and an unnecessary assumption. Now, if you just take an unnecessary assumption, like God, now that's different, because now it begs the question, because there is no reason why I have to accept that God exists.
Well, I guess every assumption you make begs the question.
No, because if you deny logic, this is what is anything that can be built upon logic is necessitated by logic, and logic is necessitated by your ability to speak, by your ability to act, by any single decision in your life, because otherwise you are in a place of complete incoherence.
Right.
You cannot even argue that you are justified or unjustified. You cannot even argue that you exist. You can't even argue that you are acting in a certain way. I would even go so far as to say that since you've now become incapable of language, the concept of self, the internalized I, has been destroyed, and that you could only say this is true if you're willing to destroy your own ego. And so since you're incapable of doing that, the being that you are necessitates logic. It's not something you can choose to accept. You have accepted it.
All right. I'm not sure I would agree that you cannot get rid of your ego.
Well, you can. You can get rid of your ego, but then if you've got rid of your ego and you've entered a state of, let's say, complete egolessness, then your actions are no longer your own.
Right. Okay, so let me explain this perspective that I told you briefly about earlier. It's kind of perspectivism. I've heard it's also being called, and the way I use this term is that so the most fundamental claim I make is that you can't say anything about anything without assuming perspective, and perspective is fundamental assumptions, and these assumptions have to be assumed axiomatically, if you will, including logic. Logic is part of that perspective, and you can imagine different perspectives that are made up of different logical frameworks. Maybe you cannot actually imagine it.
Yeah, give me an example of something you can imagine that doesn't fit logic.
Maybe you cannot actually imagine it, but you can conceptualize it. Like,
can you? You can conceptualize something you can't imagine.
Well, in a sense, I am bound by logic.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I am bound by logic. But philosophically speaking, I say that I assume that logical framework.
Yeah.
Even if I don't actively assume it. It's not a choice to assume this perspective.
Exactly. But that's where we would say that it is true by definition. That's the difference. Where we would say something begging the question is not. So, for example, to assume that it is right or wrong to murder. Now, if it was just a wild assumption, well, then it may be committing the naturalistic fallacy, for example. You're assuming because something does feel pain, or because whatever reason you've actually placed upon it, that it is, in fact, right or wrong. Now, that's what kind of happens in a Kantian sense, I would argue. That's not a place I would like to go. So, for example, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't necessarily say that we come to the conclusions of right and wrong because we have based upon unjustified assumptions. I think that we are forced into a place of accepting conceptions of right. Excuse me, I'm drinking like the fizziest drink ever. I shouldn't have. But essentially, like, take for example, I think this is where I think if I was to steel man your argument, if I'm honest, I think your position would be. It would be arguing that the various rationalities that we've assumed, not logic itself, because, yeah, of course, we'll all have to use logic, but the form of rationality that we use to justify something as right or wrong is an inherent assumption. So this would be, for example, the difference between um, conservatism in the Hegelian sense, liberal individualism. They all have various conceptions of objectivity. And how we express objectivity is how we come to the conclusions in regards to how we think and conceptualize in the first place. And so, like, for example, if we take one method of proving something and then another method of proving something, these are philosophies in and of themselves. These are language games. And that by adopting these languages, this language, then I can start my conceptual growth through logic. But that actual adoption of the language is something that is the perspective in the first place. So I couldn't say to someone who speaks an entirely different language, who speaks from an entirely different historical, philosophical tradition, that you should come to a conceptual conclusion because that concept may not exist in their framework. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, sort of. I'm not sure I got everything
So
there.
you're accepting logic. Okay.
Yes, yes. And I would like to establish that. So let's say that we both accept logic.
Yeah.
Because that's on the very fundamental level, that, like, does objectivity or subjectivity even exist? Like, do we exist? I don't think that's our discussion here. We're talking about veganism after all, and we're talking about morality. So we could make it a little more concrete and just, okay, let's assume logic.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good place to start. Like,
but I would still call it an assumption. That is my point. I don't want to
call it whatever you like.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, that's not the debate we're having. We have logic, and it's necessary for us to communicate to have established that. And it's also necessary for us to establish a common language. We need to define the words we're using and make sure that they mean the same.
The law of identity.
Right, exactly. So I would like to define morality, first of all.
Okay. So
I think that's a good place to start here. Like, what is morality? What are we actually talking about in this discussion?
Okay, I'm talking about the what defines good and the ways in which we would define good and bad behavior.
The ways in which we would define good and bad behavior.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm just quoting the Oxford Dictionary right now, and it says principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. Could you assume that definition?
Well, I don't think I've got to assume it. I'd say that.
Right. would you accept that definition?
Yeah, I would accept the definition. If you want to, then, I mean, what you're going to have to ask is what is good?
Yes. Exactly. So this definition itself does not really give us any guidance to what these principles actually are or what constitutes good behavior.
Yeah, because that's first order moral truth. So this would be like you've already assumed what good is, and then from that point you would be talking about the good. Now, if you've already assumed what good is, then we could be talking two separate languages about what the good is.
Right. We can have different principles.
Yeah, we could have different definitions of good.
Right.
So now we're taking a metaethics, which is second order of moral truth.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to ask me what good is, I would say good is defined by that which is desirable.
Okay. Desirable. So that kind of necessitates a subjective being, I presume.
Yeah.
It is desired by a subjective being.
You cannot help to desire that which is desirable.
Right.
It's necessitated by your own existence. Yes. Yeah.
Can a computer desire something?
No.
Okay, so what is desire then?
Desire is the phenomenological experience of that drives you forward. It's will itself.
Okay. So you have defined, now that we talk about good, you have defined good using a subjective experience of, well, sentient beings. Your definition of good requires sentient beings. Without sentient beings,
Yeah,
there is no conception of right and wrong.
100%. I think Ask Yourself said this, like a computer could have just make a system of right and wrong.
Right.
I just said that's ridiculous.
I mean, I don't disagree. I really don't.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think we
because
probably share a lot of the moral values that we have.
yeah,
I mean, most definitely.
I think that because to reject that, you would have to be rejecting evaluation itself, and I think then you'd have to be rejecting your own experience, which is to evaluate. So I
Right.
think it would be nonsensical, wouldn't it?
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, I think we're actually getting somewhere. Where we're getting it. We're getting more concrete.
Yeah,
So okay. So I accept that. Let's define good as that which is desirable, and
yeah.
that is dependent on subjective beings.
Okay. And you
So,
already desire. So you would already be posited
mhm.
by, because you already desire, then you already have various desires. However, it's which desire you act upon, because morality is the governance of good and bad. And in which case, it's how we determine which desire to follow and which desire not to follow.
All right. So would you then call it objective? So maybe here's another word that we have to define: objective. So we've established some fundamental
I would
idea
say
of what morality is.
we're meeting objective morality now. So that would be, this is called minimal objectivity. So this would be epistemic, where we would say, okay, good and bad exist. I don't deny that good and bad exist. Now, through universalism, as it's sometimes called, I necessitate a position of happiness. So essentially, by understanding myself and my nature, what I am seeking is happiness. Now, happiness is the judgment of good and bad for the longest period of time. Okay, or the greatest good, and the least evil. Right, the greatest amount of desirability, that which is most desirable, I desire inherently, and that which is least desirable, I inherently do not desire, because that would breach what it means to desire in the first place. Given that I seek happiness, I must come to the conclusion of how to reach that happiness. And this is where I was saying that you principally would disagree with me, because you're now going to argue that rationality can vary of how we reach that happiness in the first place. The way in which we think, the way in which we conceptualize the world, the language in which we use will grow invariably differently, and thus we will come to different conclusions of how we should act.
Right. Yeah. The thing is, I actually made a video about this. The title of the video is "Morality is Subjective," which I guess you would disagree with, even though I say kind of what you are saying right now.
Yeah, this is actually moral egoism. This is
Yes.
that's moral egoism, and that's not subjective. That's I mean, it is ontologically subjective, kind of, right? Because the thing is that a subjectivist could just assume that position. An objectivist cannot. They would say that I am governed by what I am, and what I am was given to me. It's not a choice. Now, you cannot construct yourself. The only way you could argue this is maybe if you take like a Nietzschean stance of like the Übermensch, where you are the will that wills its own will. And I would say that's nonsensical and it breaches language. So, yeah, like I would say that it's based, like Ayn Rand would say that life itself gives you this, right? You are determined from this type of happiness, and what you are tells you like instances of how you're going to be happy. But how you conceptualize that, I think, is where your argument would stand.
Yeah. So you kind of agreed that it was subjective in a sense. What did you say, ontologically?
That's what some people argue, that it's ontologically subjective. So that they would say that there's nothing about your being, nothing about being itself that necessitates that. Now, I actually reject that in this regard, and I think you do too, because you'd be saying that you accept that you are governed by your own nature in this regard, like by what you are. That necessitates your will, your desiring, necessitates a certain way of behaving, and that is egoism. You can't help but seek happiness.
Right. But that happiness and everything that we're talking about, your perception of the world, is dependent
There
of
we
your
go.
perception of the world, right?
That's the different variations of rationality, of how we conceptualize and come to different conclusions.
Right. So that is the definition of subjective that I'm using. And in that sense, I think, well, it is obviously subjective.
See, I would say it's relative.
Okay, relative. Define relative.
So it is invariance, but it cannot be, it is not purely based upon one individual's observation. It can be given as a formula that is mind independent. Linguistically, I could say that your happiness, like for example, I could tell you that your happiness is not something you think it is, and that by that achieving those desires in which you think you want are actually not going to bring the state which is phenomenologically necessitated by your being. So to give you a solid example, a drug addict may desire a drug in a moment. It's bloody freezing. May desire a drug in a moment, but that would not bring them happiness. It would bring them a phenomenological experience of goodness. So it would bring them something they desire. But overall, their phenomenological experience of their life, this is the judgment of happiness throughout, because happiness is the judgment of good throughout the whole lives. That would not, it could not do that, because it would end up suffering, and they're simply not giving credit to this suffering in their rationality. They're not considering this to the fullest extent, that they will actually have this suffering. Now, I can say with justification that an individual would have this suffering based upon language, because I know what you are. I know that based upon my experience of other people, based upon what people are and how they live, that it will, in fact, this drug, this withdrawal symptoms from the drug will cause you suffering. Now, you might be of the knowledge of that. You might simply not know that it will cause you suffering. In which case, you take the drug. Now, I would say you've actually committed an immoral act, because you have done that which is not desirable.
Shit. All right. Well, okay, so let's back it up. When we talked about happiness, I would argue that, okay, happiness itself is dependent on the mind. And through that definition of subjective, I would argue that happiness is subjective. Now, you may construct a different perspective using different definitions that actually demonstrates that
it's phenomenologically subjective. Like, no one can experience my happiness. Do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, for happiness to exist, that requires a mind to perceive it. So it's dependent on a mind, and therefore it's subjective based on the definition in the Oxford Dictionary.
But the whole world we've just talked about was dependent upon a mind.
Yes, so everything is subjective.
You see, this is a very, very broad definition of subjective.
Well, it's the one I find in the Oxford Dictionary. I'm open to different
well, I would say that, like, if we talk about mind-independent properties, then, and we accept that reality is a thing that pre-exists us or exists without us, which I think is rational through basic coherence.
Okay, but when you say that you think it's rational, I would argue that you assume it because it makes sense to you.
I don't assume it. I use logic to use coherence.
Yes.
To come to that conclusion.
And I would argue that your logical framework is also presupposed.
It's necessitated. And I would say everyone has to assume it.
All right, but even if everyone has to assume it, logic itself is dependent on their minds. So this is just, I guess this is just a play of words.
I mean, of course, I could also make the argument that their minds are dependent upon logic.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, but regardless,
this kind of
so now you have existence itself, and now we've got that. Now, where do you want to take it? Because I could say, like, within this whole subjective framework in which you say that there is a moral obligation, and I will use coherence to build in a correlate.
There's a moral obligation.
No, I'm saying that, like, I will use that to build it into moral obligations.
Right. Yeah, so you can, of course, construct a language in which veganism is a moral obligation.
Okay, so that would be one instance of rationality. So this is where
Yes.
you're saying,
This
yeah.
would be a perspective.
Now, I would say that
Objective,
you're
dependent on
not
your mind.
actually wrong, right? Like if you grew up in a place where the concepts of your language have not developed to the point in which veganism is necessitated, then you cannot hold that moral obligation because ought implies can. However, I would say that doesn't mean that veganism isn't morally superior because it's a greater conceptualization of the world based upon the same epistemic justifications as what you have used to construct the morality in the first place. And morality is necessary to achieve your own happiness based on volition. And that's something that you have to assume.
Yes, I would say it's assumed, it is verified through our subjective experience of the world. Therefore, it's subjective based on the definition I'm using of the word. I think we're kind of exhausting this now. We're just going in circles. But I think it is a very good, it's a good
There's a way to do it. Do you think you should go
concrete.
vegan?
Yeah, so let's break it down. Let's talk about veganism, because now we've talked a lot about moral relativism, subjectivity and objectivity. So let's talk about the more concrete aspects of this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, cool. I will say that just in this case, that I would say that the progression of any given language will be the proper universalization of a word, of a concept, which is the innately self-conscious, improving upon itself, conceptualizing the world in a greater capacity, and then internalizing it. And that's why moral progress occurs. And it's why all scientific progress occurs. And sometimes this is named the science of right, particularly by Georg Wilhelm Hegel. And that's the place I'm taking. So this would apply to all languages and all language communities. Now, obviously, if you wanted to debate that at some point, that's fair enough. If you want to have a look into it. But let's get in then now to veganism.
So veganism is, okay, maybe I will avoid the word objective, but is objectively a superior moral framework to an alternative.
Okay, so that now you can see where I'm going, that morals are objective or not, where these values come from.
Breaking up.
Can you see where these values come from? Like, for example, where I can say that I must act in one way to achieve my own happiness. You would agree on that. So that's like where we're saying
your own happiness.
Yeah, that's our line. That's egoism.
Right, exactly, and that's probably a moral framework that I share. Egoism.
Yeah. So now, how do we get from egoism to altruism? Is your question?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. So cool. So I would say that the reason that we get from egoism to altruism is because egoism, being an inherently subjective stance, in the sense that people will see your desire as opposing theirs, as a resistance. Okay, your desire is a desire which can involve them. For example, I may desire someone. I may desire something they also desire. I'm placing upon them, I'm placing a relation upon them that they can observe. They can observe my relation to the world. Right? Now, they can choose to accept that or deny it, okay, at a most fundamental level before language. But without me, they cannot choose what is good for them in the first place. And then they are forced into a language game. And then we start talking about abstract concepts such as good, bad, right, and wrong. Now, these abstract concepts are built upon my phenomenological experience, but they're also built upon yours. And the only way that we can decide that these are inherently the actual concepts we are talking about, that these actually hold true, is by verifying them based upon each individual's concepts. So to give
and you verify it for yourself subjectively.
But if you verify for yourself subjectively, then all you have is coherence. And your coherence, which you've used in the first place, starts to break down because what you rely upon is the verification of the other to free you from your own inherently biased state.
I cannot verify that the other person objectively exists.
Okay, you can't verify that they objectively exist, but you would say through coherence that they most rationally do.
I would assume it. You would call it justify belief. I would call it an assumption.
You can assume it all you want, but you're necessitated to do it, because if you start rejecting it, then you've started rejecting all of those truth statements that you've built up through coherence in the first place.
Right. So I don't necessarily choose my assumptions, but they are assumptions.
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah, if you want to, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. In which case, I would say that these are assumed by every single individual who enters a language game in the first place.
Yeah, you assume that because it makes sense to you.
Well, I think it's necessitated, and that it
Right.
can't help but be the case. Unless you can give us an example where it wouldn't occur.
No, I probably agree. I share that assumption. I share it. So it's
you know, we're just irrational together, is that?
yes. It's intersubjective between the two of us.
It's intersubjective, right?
Intersubjective. I would not go as far as say that it's objective.
Okay, right. Okay, but
it's just a matter of words and how we define them.
Let's take an intersubjective thing. Would you say that English, or let's take Russian as a language, as an object? If you were to learn Russian, is Russian objective or is it subjective?
It's Russian. It's a language. It's a concept. In my mind, it's subjective.
Okay, it's a concept, but it's a metaphysical object. Russian is a technology, is what I would argue.
Okay.
Right? Now, if it's a technology, it exists. Would you say that something like, I don't know, theoretical physics or physics itself, is physics subjective?
Well, yeah, to be consistent, I would have to say that everything is subjective.
Okay, but then that's the companions of guilt argument. So now you've rejected physics, you've rejected history, you've rejected every single place in which you could use.
What do you mean reject it? I reject that it's objective, but I do assume it because I think that physics makes sense to me.
Okay, so you're saying that you could justify, could you be justified in rejecting it? That's what I'm saying.
Yes. If it makes sense to reject it, a subjective being could theoretically reject these notions, but I personally don't do that.
Okay, but this is what I'm saying. It can never make sense to reject it because you would breach coherence.
For myself, yes.
No, but that's the thing. You would always breach coherence because now you are saying that these instances within experience themselves don't actually mean what you assumed they meant in the first place. So these would be the abstracted concepts. But I would actually go so far to say that we're already in a situation where we've accepted intersubjectivity to have language and have reason in the first place. I think to deny it is to deny the fact that we're having a conversation.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Okay. And then once we hit that point, then we talk about subjective and objective. So objective from my mind, and I assume that you are an actual object of my, not just of my experience, but an object. That you are not a construction of my thought.
Yes, now you're okay. Well, you're sort of speaking my language in the sense that you're saying that you assume that I exist as an object.
Yeah. Oh no. This is the mind reality distinction. I can't force you to say that it definitely exists. I mean, if I could, I would be definitely winning a Nobel Prize right now.
Yeah. I mean, let's assume together intersubjectively that we share a lot of assumptions. Like our subjective perspectives intersect.
Yeah.
But here we have a disagreement still. So let's identify which assumptions differ.
I think this is good. You think this is bad, for example.
Yeah, for example.
Yeah, so anything. It could be anything. Like you say it's a rock, I say it's not a rock. You say, and everything like that.
Yeah, but so let's talk about veganism then.
Well, yeah. So how do we? But let's keep it basic because veganism is quite a complex construct, right? Let's keep it basic. How do we decide? Like, let's say we think maybe one of us is hallucinating an object is or isn't there. Okay, so based on our subjectivity, we cannot say for definite because we've already assumed that reality exists and that people exist within reality exterior to us. Now, based upon that, can we say that, for example, there is a dragon outside or not? So if I go outside and I'm like, "Whoa, did you see that class dragon?" And then you're like, no, man, you're tripping balls here. Like, there's definitely no dragon outside. Now, there's
That
just
can actually happen.
yeah. Let's just say there's two of us. Is there any way that we could 100% verify that one is right or wrong? I think we could be justified in assuming that one is probably tripping balls, but that's based upon the whole experiences of one's life. In which case I would appeal to the fact, I'd be like, have you ever seen a dragon? Could dragons exist? Blah, blah, blah. And we'll go down that line of reasoning and I'll pull into your coherence. But if we're just in that scenario, no, you're right. Because we're in a situation where epistemic justification has reached an impasse. We are both in a position of absolute bias, where we are promoting our own perceptions over the others, our own conceptions over the others. However, how would we overcome this?
Well, I guess through our intersubjectivity.
Yeah,
or overcome.
we would go, excuse me, mate, do you see that dragon?
Okay, right.
We're pulling a third party.
Yeah, so we would, no, exactly, sure.
Yeah. And this is where it becomes coherence again, because now I'm building up the coherence in your mind so that you start questioning, wait a minute, like all of these mental constructs inside my head are telling me that in fact there is no dragon. Now, what I can tell you is that there isn't actually a dragon in this sense. And it doesn't mean that the dragon doesn't exist in your perception, but that beyond your perception, there is no dragon. Right? And since you're assuming that there is another person as well as a dragon, then one of them, either all people are fake or there's no dragon. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
And here's where science comes from, right?
Yeah, this is where science goes. Now, if we say that, if we move that to morality, so like how to govern good or bad, now I would say that we evidence our phenomenological experiences in relation to our judgments. So we would say, based upon, let's say, like a judgment of good or bad, we would say that to judge something as being good or bad, as desirable, we will judge it against, first of all, ourselves. We would say like, oh, well, this is good for me, this is bad for me. Now, if I say like, is this good for Rich? I'm evidencing you. And to evidence you, I pull into this question of what it means to live the good life as a human, as a man, as whatever. But I have to do the same thing for me in the first respect, because even if I said in the first place, I think this, then I've inherently become biased, and I can be a victim of my own subjectivity, the same as the drug addict, where I simply I'm not saying that the dragon isn't there. Right, I'm dismissing all of the other coherence that is telling me that the dragon isn't there, and so I've accepted that other people are a source for verification. As soon as I accept that, then in relation to myself, then I can start to internalize values. Based upon internalizing these values, I would say that judging something as good or bad, right, means desirable in regards to those beings in question. Is it good or bad to eat meat? The judgment includes a human and an animal. It can be considered that enjoyable phenomenologically for me, but a lot worse for an animal. So then we come into the question is, there is an instancing of two goods. Which one should we choose?
That of the animal or that of me?
That of the animal, that of me.
Right.
And then we'll fall back onto the concept of equality. So we would say this happens in humans. Which should we choose?
Well, based on so egoism, the way I see it, is that you prioritize yourself above all else.
Mm-hmm. But then this is the point, though. Ayn Rand in Egoism says the desires of rational men do not contradict each other. And I would say that occurs because to use someone as a means to an end, to use them as a way to gain your own happiness, you've already rejected the intersubjectivity required in language to prove your happiness. You've used them as a way as a consumption. You've already come up with the notion of happiness and sought to achieve it before working out how to actually achieve the happy life.
All right. Okay. So now that we've started talking about veganism more concretely, I'd like to add another disclaimer, which I just realized that I forgot to add in the beginning, and that is that I do sympathize a lot with the vegan movement. I'm actually considering going full vegan myself
Hey,
because, yeah, no, I'm considering it. I'm trying, I guess. So, I mean, we probably have, we share most of these moral ideas.
yeah.
But where we differ is whether we believe that it's an obligation objectively, and that I can tell someone else that they are bound by these ideas that I have.
See, I would say that you can only tell someone else that exists within a language community which would have the concepts necessary for communication. If you
Right.
start talking to someone who didn't understand equality, for example,
Yeah.
well, then you'd be talking nonsensically to them.
Yes, or didn't understand what we have just established, that intersubjectivity, everything that we just established, logic, for example. We need to establish this common language to communicate with them, first of all, and
Yeah,
then to convince them that veganism is right.
I agree, and that's what I do.
Yes, and that's great, and I support it. I support it.
Now,
Certainly, but there are people who do not speak your language, and for them, subjectively, it is not wrong to kill animals.
what I would say is that they cannot be held morally accountable for that they do not know. This would be like Jesus nailed to the cross. Forgive them for they know not what they have done. It's not that they have not committed a wrongful act, it's just that they lack the science of right. It's Newtonian physics before relativity. They lack the conceptual progress necessary to see the world for how it truly is.
All right.
Foucault actually gives this argument for ancient Christians, talking about slavery. Says ancient Christians didn't have a choice. He's like, they didn't know what equality was. He's like, they knew it in a very vague sense, but that kind of equality wasn't the equality we have now. We're not speaking of the same concept. They had not developed it. And that's just reason itself. And I would even go so far to say that imposing this upon other people would be a wrong, because once we do that, we have breached their subjectivity, and they have not actually progressed. We have not given them a new concept from which they will act upon. We have actually changed their, and this is why Hegel would say it's all about freedom. He says we've changed them from the master that they had, which was the subjective desires that they were being ruled by that they couldn't see, and we've replaced them with another set. What we've done is we've manipulated them, we've coerced them, we've not actually changed them and progressed them. But progress ultimately leads not only to the freedom of individuals, but will ultimately lead to a more moral and better society, because it will increase our likelihood of acting morally in the future. So if we say that, for example, if I went to Saudi Arabia and told them, the way you treat women, I think is appalling. And I can even give like a conceptual argument as to why I think treating women equally is inherently necessary. They probably wouldn't understand me, even if we were speaking the same like linguistic tongue. The concepts I'm conveying just simply do not exist. And if I try to enforce that upon them, I'm not creating moral growth. So what we have to take them through is the Socratic method. Challenge their assumptions, get them to think about why they are committing these acts, and reconceptualize in a way based upon themselves. And this is self-growth.
Right. And one way of doing that is raising awareness, obviously, for the suffering that all of the animals have to go through for them to have the burger in their hands, for example. And you can do that by showing them videos from slaughterhouses. And that is a very effective strategy of creating vegans.
Yeah.
And when I say that you create vegans, what I mean by that is that you actually make it wrong to kill animals. It wasn't wrong until they saw the video. Seeing the video makes it wrong for them to eat meat.
Well, it's kind of that tie between Aristotle and Kant, where Kant would say, "Oh, it implies can," end of, you cannot have an obligation to that which you did not know. And I would agree. But Aristotle talks more broad, where he would say, yeah, well, actually, there is, there's good and bad things that would do that we're just unaware of. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't then become aware of them and act in obligation to them. It's just that we cannot act in obligation to that which we did not know of.
Right. It's not part of our subjective sphere.
Yeah, well, this doesn't mean that it's not an obligation. It just means that we don't know of our obligations. It hasn't been discovered yet.
Right. So it doesn't exist.
Yeah, it does exist. It's just,
How
it's
does
like
it exist? Does anything exist
in the
outside of your
same way,
subjective experience?
it exists within your subjective experience. It exists within this reality in which you occupy. The only difference is you haven't accurately conceptualized it. It's a flaw in the way you think, not in something that is simply not corporeal.
But you see what I mean? That
Oh,
if
I
we are
completely agree
subject,
with you. I
yeah,
don't think we're disagreeing. I'm just saying
right.
that it's a discovery, not an invention.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess we can call it a discovery.
Yeah.
Discovery. But I would still say that we create this morality.
Oh, I would say that concepts are constructive and
Yes, yes, yes.
are not abstractions.
Right.
Yeah, 100%. And one of the reasons that allows them to grow and progress further as well. Anyway,
So is veganism a matter of perspective?
veganism is a matter of a perspective in which we are necessitated in. I'd say for everyone, like everyone who can understand veganism, what it means,
Because of
and
people who cannot understand veganism.
well, I'd say people who can't understand veganism. One, I would say that they don't exist in the Western Hemisphere.
All right.
I would say that they pretty much don't exist in most places in the world, and that these are people whose language lacks the proper explanation of equality in the first place.
Okay. So if the concept of veganism has never occurred to them.
No, it's the same. I would say it's exactly the same way as saying that um, the like for example, Newtonian physics could not have existed in ancient Rome. I have no problem with that.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean that the science that Newtonian physics is based upon didn't exist. The world clearly did exist. You
Would
know,
you say that Newtonian physics is a perspective?
yeah.
So it's a matter of perspective whether or not Newtonian physics.
It's an objective perspective. It's like, for example, it's the
Okay.
conception, it's the concept of I, isn't it? It's, for example, when you assume the I, you have alienated what you are and you start analyzing yourself.
An objective perspective.
Yeah, this is why we seek objectivity for freedom itself.
Okay, so let's define perspective here to see whether a perspective can actually be objective. Because to me, that kind of, yeah, there's friction there.
It's yeah, well, I think if you mean objective in the sense that it is inherently mind independent in every single way of in every single sense, then I would say that the only reason that this could be mind independent is because this perspective in which you adopt exists whether your mind assumes it or not. And that this perspective really is just an accurate conception of the world. That's not to say that you haven't assumed it into your subjectivity, into your mind. Of course you have, but your mind is all that you can know in the first place. That's all that you could possibly know about. It's the totality of your existence.
Right. Yes, because my definition of a perspective is that it's made up of assumptions. Assumptions, yeah, they are axioms, and they are not verified objectively, but subjectively. This, again, we come back to this initial discussion
How is
of
it?
how we define the words.
See, I think that like this is the difference. It depends upon if you've assumed based upon your subjectivity, and I think you're necessitated to assume that other people exist as we've been through, and you enter that situation, then the real world is constituted through coherence.
Right.
Now, if you were to say that an individual which was left in a world without other people, would they have this necessitation of the exterior world? No. This is a social construct. but it's a construct that frees us from this ignorance. And if we look at perspective, this dictionary definition, I think, will do fine. It's a particular attitude towards or way of regarding something, a point of view. Now, if we were to say that it's a point of view and that we can adopt various points of view, which we
Yeah.
can, then yeah, veganism can be an objective perspective. Now, if we were to say perspective itself is the phenomenological experience of the present, then nothing is objective.
Yeah. Right. So when you say that it's an objective perspective, you mean that it's necessary to make these assumptions underlying veganism.
It's what objectivity means, because if you've
sure.
already assumed objectivity does not exist, if you've assumed that perspective can be the other way around, it wouldn't make sense. It would be grammatically incorrect to say that you could have an objective perspective. In fact, to even understand something as objective from a perspective as something mind independent, well, that doesn't make any sense. Nothing could possibly ever be mind independent, because the totality of my existence is a mind.
Right. So maybe it's a bad definition, but if that's the definition I'm using, you would agree that it's not objective.
No offense, I would say it's a bad definition.
Yeah, I'm open to it.
I would say that mainly because not only does it say that objectivity doesn't exist in and of itself, but that even your subjectivity is called into question. Like, take, for example, in the Cartesian understanding of it, the I, he comes back to, I think, therefore I am. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And Kant shows this, that I is assumed in that scenario. The only thing that you can know is that there is a thinking thing.
Oh, you know what? Yeah, you know what I would say? I would say I, therefore I.
You see, that is what Kant uses to criticize Descartes and says you're begging the question.
Right. Yeah, and what I mean by that is that it is assumed. You assume
you'd be better off saying and that's it.
Yeah, I.
No.
Okay, so if you say I, the only thing you have is I.
You don't have
to say I think.
The only thing you can have is the flat sensual experience that is presented to you.
Right.
No questions can be asked or answered. Language itself has been negated, and all you have is a variation of unintelligible constructs.
Right. So if you say I think, therefore I am, you're not just making one assumption. You're actually making several assumptions in that one sentence.
Yeah, I mean, using language would be the fucking killer. The problem with this, if you literally put yourself in an immediate present state in which there was nothing no thoughts through your mind, or even the thoughts through your mind, you remove that bias, which lets you assume that it is you, or that you are acting in some way, or that it is performing some sort of thing that you got in some way in control of, then all you have is a sense experience.
Yeah. So what do we actually get if we assume I in this vacuum?
See, this is the thing. If you don't assume anything, then the difference is that of looking at the sky and seeing stars, or looking at the sky and seeing black with white pinholes.
Right.
Okay. Okay.
Perspectives, huh? Different perspectives.
Exactly. So this is why I would say, like, if you assume that is the totality of if that is perspective itself, if you say perspective is, then, and anything that exists within it is just part of this and anything, and objectivity cannot be reached, then you would be rejecting all possible questions and answers upon it. Understanding no longer seems to be coherent. You've rejected understanding itself. Okay, cool. Right. Right. Is there anything else you'd like to bring up?
Well, where are we?
Well, I
I think
think
we agree largely. We use different words. We define them slightly differently. I'm open to embrace your definitions, but I would obviously have to establish them and get into them and see whether they're consistent with my perspective. I'd like to do that. So when I say, "Oh, objectivity is defined as this," and I quote the Oxford Dictionary, that is not a definition that I hold to be true. It is just a definition that I assume. So I can assume your definition as well, and I'd like to do that. But I cannot just change one definition. I would have to change my whole language.
you see, I think that there's a few things that language cannot be an individualist task. You would agree there?
I'm not so sure. I think that I can define terms any way I want.
See, if you start stipulating that, then it's no longer a language.
The thing is, I would also say that for us to communicate effectively, we would have to establish common definitions. We would have to establish a common language.
I would say that you've lost meaning itself. I would say that what you've done is that you've constructed something which it's not just, it's a baseless assumption that this is what is. It's it cannot be said to be true without anything but coherence. And if you mean simply that it's you see, this is where I had the so actually I might have a nice quote for you here, actually, if you'd like to hear it, from a man called Emmanuel Levinas. My phone's died. Oh,
Right.
essentially, he says that
What was his name?
Levinas. But I mean, really, if you want to look into language itself and why
Yeah.
languages cannot be individualistic, then you want to look into a guy called Wittgenstein. Their language games, philosophical language games. Language works upon rules. And these rules aren't self-defined, because if they are self-defined, then it no longer ceases to be a language, because you haven't actually taken anything from your experience and placed it anywhere else. You've actually just stipulated you've just transferred your experience to two separate places.
Okay, no, like I said, I'm philosophically illiterate, so I'd love to dive into Wittgenstein and learn more about the philosophy of language.
Good luck. It's a bastard, but it's great. It's great. It's a great book. I think Philosophical Investigations is what it's called.
Right. Philosophical Investigations.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just explain, because I have a background in computer science, and to me, in computer science, we define everything. We define the universe. So that is where I'm coming from. When I say that, oh, let's define objectivity, to me, objective is an empty variable that we assign meaning to. We assign a value to it.
But this is the difference between creatio ex nihilo, like creation from nothing, and a creator, right? You are the creator in this scenario. Something has given you you've given this computer its first word, the basis of its algorithms to produce and create more algorithms, even if you allowed it to have algorithmic production, has come from you. Now, in humans, we could say that it has come from natural selection, that we are given the first word by our nature, and tabula rasa.
Yeah.
But that this is inherently necessitated by our nature, our desiring. I never said that we can just create language. And that's the difference. If you're saying that we can, then you can be the will that wills your own will. Yeah. I think that's nonsensical.
Right. So could we not redefine words?
Oh, we can redefine words. That's different. We can create new concepts that are matched by the utterances and how it's actually used. If I was actually going to use a Wittgenstein quote, right. And he says, think of the tools in a toolbox. The functions of words are The functions of words are as diverse as the functions of these objects. What confuses us is the uniform appearance of words when we see them in script, when we hear them spoken or meet them in script and print, for their application is not presented to us so clearly. So the concept behind the word is what we're talking about, not just the word.
Okay, but for me, when you say
So
when I hear the word objective, that means something to me. That variable has a value
yeah,
to me subjectively, and you may have a different value assigned to that word. And that is what I mean by establishing a common language, that we want to kind of make sure that we assign the same meaning to the words that we are using when we're talking to each other.
exactly. That's the rules of the game.
Yeah, we would have to do. I mean, we have to do that, but
And
we
that's
can.
necessitated, yeah, by for language to operate as a communication.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So what I said was that going into this discussion, we have different definitions of these words, and I don't say that my definition is true. It's just assumed, and I could assume a different word. I could assume a different definition of these words that we're using. I could assume your definitions, but I could not just assume your definition of one word. I would have to match my other definitions so it's consistent and makes sense to me.
Yes, grammar we'll have to use, but then I would say that is logic.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
My sense-making mechanism, what I call it, yeah, that's logic. My logic.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree.
Yeah. So I think here is where we just have different definitions of the words, and I
Well,
mean, it's
Wittgenstein
hard.
goes so far to say that there are no problems of philosophy and only problems of language.
Yes, yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. I mean, you probably love the guy. I mean, he's I mean, if you're interested in computer science, it'd be really nice to see someone that actually does another subject that cares about philosophy. Come on, guys, we do actually talk about important stuff sometimes, like. So yeah, I mean, I'll be interested. I mean, if you apply that to something like artificial intelligence, for example, and how to create an artificial intelligence in a language to communicate, and even a self-awareness within an artificial intelligence and stuff like that, you could really get into. There's a lot of areas to grow in that regard. You probably get funded. Unfortunately, philosophers do not get funded.
You can get a PhD, man.
I know that's the thing. Anyway, but the point is what I would say is that the difference that we're saying there is, yeah, you could redefine the word, but can you redefine the concept within the word?
The
No.
meaning behind it.
Yeah, like you
Because
can't.
the word is just the meaning we assign to it.
Yeah, and
So
but
if
that is that the thing is though is like the important part of recognizing this sense making mechanism is that because of the grammar of the structure of our words is not inherent to our being, but it's essentially something internalized. The way we understand something is grammatically tied up into our language. Take for example the difference between placing an object in something like English and Latin. The object actually of the language moves location. So when you'd say, and in various languages, I think Latin-based languages, they'll say something like, I don't know how to say it. Like it's actually so weird. It's like saying, like they'll be like it would be like almost like rather than I ride my bike, it would be like, uh, bike I ride, right? And that's like a grammatical construction, right? But like if we were to say that, it's nonsensical. Right, because when we hear that, we're like, "What?" Like, you sound like Master Yoda here. It doesn't make any, you've changed the object of the word, like the sentence. It's the syntax. Actually, that's the word I'm looking for, like the syntax. Now, that is something that I think we use to judge whether something is rational or irrational. And that is why language is reason. Because if you start using a word, if you started stipulating a new definition for a word, like you start changing the definition of a word, you would start to see, like, for example, wait a minute, if you started saying like if you just created a sentence, let's say you changed the word purple to mean I don't know,
whatever.
like
Yeah.
yeah, like hot, right?
Uh-huh.
Like and you touched some water and you said this water is very purple.
Mhm.
people would look at you and go, "What the hell are you talking about? That's nonsensical."
But it's not.
No,
From my
people.
perspective, it's not. If he just switches those words, it would be a perfectly consistent perspective.
But this is the thing. He's just switched two concepts there, right? But
Sure. Yeah.
like, but whether he could create a new concept, that's the difference, isn't it? So like what he's saying there is he's switching purple and hot, and he means hot, and he can relate that to his concept of hot. But then it's just a grammatical construction, in which case it's the tool and toolbox. And that's how we can create new ways of using words. I actually wrote an essay on hate speech where I said a lot of hate speech is becoming reappropriated in language. So, for example, when PewDiePie said the N word, or when people like I think South Park used like stipulated a definition for fag and said that it means someone that rides a loud motorcycle through the street. That's fine. No, that's fine. But the way that we could say that it is actual proper linguistic expression is for people to understand it. And then what you will do is he will, so for example, if you say like, "Oh, this makes sense," no, let me explain why it makes sense. And then you will use another sentence to explain the sentence you've just gave. And Wittgenstein says it's like painting a picture of your picture, right? You basically go like, "All right, wait a minute. Like I used the word purple in this respect." And then eventually you can bring it down to the verification where you get them to touch the hot water and go purple.
Mm.
Okay. Now that's fair enough, but you're not creating a concept. It's not concept creation.
Right. It's just language.
This is language, yeah. If you're talking about like, could you just create a concept? No, I don't think you can just manifest one out of nowhere.
Right. Do you think that we can objectively verify that we communicate effectively? That is to say that we have the same language.
So, like, could we say that one language was better than another?
No, I mean, I would say that it's impossible for us to verify, again, objectively, 100% certainty
Okay,
that
100% certain is not something I would, but we'll say like we'll say verify, because that doesn't need to be 100% certain, but yeah, verify.
right. Yeah. So to verifying that we have effective communication is by talking, and like the closest thing we get is the response from the other person, like nodding, agreeing.
It's communication.
Yeah, communication. So that is how we verify communication.
Mhm. But then, yeah, I would agree. So like, this is what Levinas calls the primordial expression, where he says that I can understand something about you that is essentially giving me the information that I need. So, like for example, if this can be as basic as resistance. So, like let's say I go to hit you, and then you go to stop me. That is a form of expression, because by watching you stop me and me being incapable of modifying your will, I now understand you as another individual in which to communicate with. And that's where I can start to build up various methodologies of conceptualization. And this would be like rationality.
Right.
And this is the basis, this is the formation of language itself. And they create the formations of various rationalities in which we adopt. These ultimately, I think, lead to the same place. That's the point.
Yeah.
Right? I thought we could move on to Q&A if you're game. We could even take.
I think we could do that. Do you want to wrap it up first, or should we do that after the Q&A?
Well, we can wrap it up. So if you'd like to give, I'll give my closing statement, and you can give yours. How does that sound good? Because like obviously that gives you the last word. And right, yeah. So to everyone who's watching, I hope that I've demonstrated that veganism is not a matter of a single perspective that someone can choose to adopt or not adopt. That it is a necessitated reality from people who can understand it. If you can understand that what moral obligations are, if you can understand that you have moral obligations to other people, that we can take you through logically to veganism being a moral obligation, and that would be the use of the Socratic method through discourse, philosophical discourse that allows your perception to come to the conclusion that actually veganism is a better conception of right. It is a greater conception of right, and this would be moral progress. That understanding perception as something all inclusive as to one's entirety of the phenomena leaves us in a situation that no questions can be asked or answered. It is flat. It is a sense experience alone. So, by assuming that we can even speak of these things, by assuming that we can know of these things, can ask and answer questions of these things, we've already started moving from perception to conception. We've started conceptualizing the world and understanding it, and thus using logic, and which necessitates all of the other steps which I have argued: language, intersubjectivity, language, and then ultimately moral obligations will lead to veganism. So, if you'd like to sum up your side.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've covered a lot of topics in this discussion, obviously. Maybe not as in depth as necessary to cover them and exhaust them.
Yeah,
Obviously not.
oh Jesus, we could not do that.
But my position going into this discussion was that veganism is not a moral obligation. It is a matter of perspective, and it is morality is subjective. Now, what we found out, what we discovered in our discussion was that we did not necessarily share the same definitions of the words that we were using in this discussion. So we started talking about language and the importance of establishing a common language for us to communicate effectively. I'm very open to change my language if I think that it makes sense to do so. So I do not religiously adhere to these definitions that I've proposed, but these are the definitions that I currently hold. And from the perspective that I use these definitions, then I think that it makes sense to say that veganism is not a moral obligation. For veganism to be considered a moral obligation, I would have to change my language, which I am open to. And ultimately, I do support veganism. I do want to reduce suffering. I share your moral values, Lewis, and I think the world would be better off if we stopped torturing animals the way we do.
Well, that's great. Like, I'm glad that we could have this discourse, and I hope that one day you do become vegan, and I hope anyone who's watching this may be influenced by the discourse, not just become vegan, but even start questioning themselves, because that's what philosophy is about. It's about developing your consciousness in the first place. So, thinking about what you can justify and why, and asking questions of why leads us to give sufficient reasons which are external from those basic levels in which we have already experienced. It broadens our horizons, if you will. So I hope this conversation has done that for others. I know that it's done it for me, because it's helped me express the philosophy that I've learned, and communicate it with others, which also helps me learn it and better my understanding of it as well. So I've gained a lot from this conversation, and I'm glad that we're able to proceed with it. So shall we move on to questions?
Let's look if there are any.
Yeah, right. So let's see if there's any Q&A. So, right.
What's up with your hair, man?
Right. I'll just right. So I think I can toggle timestamps. All right. I think I can only go back so far. Kind of. I think actually, if I take this right back, I'll just make sure that. Let's just see how far I can go back with this. Let's see. I think I can only go back so far, which is why I told people this time to try and leave the questions to the end, because I realized that I could not go back last time, and I kind of asked people. I was like, "Oh, leave your questions," and then I didn't find out until after the debate. So only questions I have are so far that I can see highlighted is SD. What's with the slick hair, Rick? This evening, man. Hot date ahead. You got a date going on, mate?
Wait, Wait, I didn't see the question.
There's a question for you saying, "What's with the slick hair, Rick? Have you got a hot date?"
Not really, no. I mean, other than this date, of course.
Yeah, obviously he's trying to look good for me. I think it was SD again. What advice would you give to the vegan activist? Polite method or rude and insulting method? Sincere question. I would say polite, because as soon as you start being rude or insulting, um, well, then you're going to basically turn people off. You're going to basically give them they're going to the rationality, their reasoning is going to be affected, and they're not actually going to enter it with the sincerity in the first place. And this is coming back to forcing moral progress. You cannot force moral progress. If you start forcing it, then you will not actually gain moral progress. That being said, some people communicate in a more aggressive way, and they will respond to more aggression. So people like Gary Yourofsky, sometimes, like, he actually resonated with me before I was a vegan, but he's not necessarily rude or impolite. He does actually manage to give the message across, and he just comes across passionately, in my opinion. So I think it's a matter of communication when it comes to a matter of like how people react to interpersonal behaviors is something ambiguous that would need to be addressed. And that's why, I don't think there's a one activist for everyone, and simply not one instance of activism where we can express a universal utterance. And this comes back to Wittgenstein again, saying, the tools in a toolbox. It's not just about what we say, but how we say them, how we express the context behind the words that allow us to question and talk to other individuals. So, I hope that answers the question. But I do think polite and respectful is usually the way to go. Let's see if there's anything else. Do you think most people share your definition of objective morality? Yeah, I do, actually. I think most people do actually share my definition of objective morality. They would not normally say something was objective from existence itself. That's me dog. They would not normally say something was objective from existence itself, as we talked about before. If we say that perspective itself is existence, and that subjectivity is existence itself, then we would not normally say that. What they'd say is that it's objective from themselves, and within that existence that they have, they can see a understanding, we'll say, of an exteriority. The concept of infinity overflows our minds, I think Levinas says. So it's there. We know it's there, but we don't know necessarily what it is. We're not given it innately. But language would be one of these metaphysical objects. I would say that was real, was relating to this reality, and it gives us the physical world in which we investigate. So I think so long as people accept things like science and other philosophies relating to this investigation of the real world, then yes, they would accept my definition of objectivity. And that's apparently not ask yourself. What is the best work by Ayn Rand? Honestly, I really just like The Virtue of Selfishness, because it's short, it's sweet. Just read the first bit that says why morality is objective, and I think most people like Atlas Shrugged. And then there's another one I was actually told to read recently again, and I can't remember what it's called, but it was all right. It was like where it includes Ayn Rand, but it's not the only person. I'll have to find it for you. It was Magnus, wasn't it? Yeah. But if you're interested, I'll find the links for you. But yeah, I'd say probably Atlas Shrugged is the most comprehensive that I would read. But Virtue of Selfishness is a nice, like, little short bit of Ayn Rand. So I would agree that the other guy's definition of morality is subjective. Yeah, I would agree that morality is subjective in that respect, but only because everything in the universe is subjective then. We're talking about, like, if we've basically stipulated a definition that subjectivity is reality. So to deny that morality would not be subjective would be that to deny morality was real, or in the first instance. So I'd be forced into a place of self-contradiction where I'd be saying morality exists and we can know it. And then at the same time, I'd be like, well, no, we can't. So that's
right.
how
You can't assume that definition because it contradicts your language. It's not consistent.
Yeah, I would say that it's not consistent at all, because the concept that is being uttered there is not one that I would say usually is represented by subjective. I will say that it's not something that I would say typically is subjective. And I think I could go so far to say that it wasn't subjective. It wasn't normally what is expressed by subjectivity, because otherwise, like, there would be no need to differentiate between objectivity and subjectivity. But if we do stipulate that as the definition, then no, I would say morality was subjective. But obviously, within that framework, I've argued for an objective stance of morality, which shows that a morality can be seen to be objective so long as we agree that coherence relates to a physical world. And I think that's something that's necessitated by logic. So I think that's all of the questions there. Yeah. So thank you all for joining us tonight. It's been a great debate. I've actually really enjoyed it. And this is actually the first debate where my opponent has showed his face. Very brave, you know. And it's been fun. And hopefully we can debate another time.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Well, have a nice night, mate. And if you've got any questions, leave them in the Oh yeah, that's right. I did link your channel in the description below. Please go and subscribe to Rich. He seems like a really nice guy, and definitely worth keeping an eye on, because obviously he knows his stuff about computer science and he's got some really good ideas. So it's been a very interesting conversation, and I hope that I can have him back on the channel. And thank you to you all, and we'll catch you next time. And like and subscribe, and leave a comment and all that stuff. Well, catch you later, guys.